a special session of the Unified Government of Wyandotte County, Kansas City, Kansas.
Good evening. I'm going to call the meeting to order.
He's only got.
I'd like to thank everyone.
I'm thinking about. That sounds like a budget meeting.
I'd like to thank everyone for being here tonight. Yeah. I'd ask the clerk to announce the meeting and call the roll, please.
A special session is being held on Thursday, April 25th, 2019, at 5 o'clock p.m. in the fifth floor conference room regarding the zoning code status. Immediately following, the commission will reconvene to the ninth floor conference room for an executive session regarding litigation and labor. Roll call. Johnson.
Here.
Kane. Here. Markley. Here. Walters.
Here.
Philbrook. Here. Bynum.
Here.
Burrows.
Here.
Townsend.
Here.
McKiernan.
Here.
Mugia.
Here.
Alvey.
Here. All right, tonight we have a presentation on the zoning code rewrite status, I think. So I'll turn it over to Mr. Bach.
Thank you, Mayor, Commission. As the Commission is aware, for the past several months, staff has been engaging in a rewrite of our zoning code in order to make it a more efficient document for use of others and our own use, and also in take into account and consideration some things we might want to modify or change. So tonight, we wanted to come before you and tell you a little bit about what's taken place over the past few months, the steps we've taken to get us where we are. We are not in a position now where we're ready for any policy direction, though in the coming months we will be. And that's why we wanted to start taking this off in chunks to kind of give you updates as to where we are and then as we come back in future months, we'll be asking you some questions for some direction from what we've been learning as we go through this process. With that, I'm going to turn it over to our Director of Planning, Rob Richardson, and let him go through where we are. Rob?
Thank you, Mr. Bach, Mayor and members of the Commission. I want to start out with a little bit of a process overview about what we've been doing with this plan, but actually before that, just as a reminder of where the zoning code has been, the last real major rewrite of the zoning code was in the 70s. There was a pretty big amendment to that in the 80s, and then it's just been piecemealed together since then. In 2004, we did two major updates. One was the commercial design guidelines that guide our commercial development, and the other was a procedures update that I'll talk about in a little bit. But we kicked off in 2018, and the consultant has been working on, and it says drafting the code, but really they've prepared white papers for our steering committee and given some draft alternatives to look at. And we've kind of delved into some deep policy discussions with them, and I'll kind of go through that tonight. But our goal is to have a draft of the code this summer and work on adoption through the fall. It's going to be a very large and significant document, and so we wanted to get in early in the springtime to start this process, because I feel like with something that affects this much of our community and the development, that we'll spend a lot of time together talking about the policies and the directions of the code. But then, once we adopt the code, I would suggest that we have a time period where, before it goes into effect, for people to be able to use either code for a while and then move to the new code, so that we have a transition process. And the other thing that I would suggest, much like we've done with the sign code, we adopted the sign code about 2 years ago. As part of this, we went back and met with all the sign companies and other sign folks to see what the issues were with the code. And so as the code comes forward, we'll have a couple of fixes to a couple of probably the only 2 issues that we've had as we move forward with the new sign code. So, and I think we ought to do that with this code as well. Give it a year or 2 for people to use it, have some more meetings, and make any adjustments we need at that time. So the broad goals are streamlining the process. You know, part of the process is encumbered by what the state requires us to do. Part of it is being able to have a small staff that is able to efficiently process all of the paperwork and all the applications that we have to process. We want to add clarity and definition to the code. One of my assignments is to interpret the code. So if something comes up that the code isn't specific enough on, the code says I have to interpret that. Well, I would like to remove that part. You can't remove that completely, but that's not one of the parts of my job that is real fun, because typically the interpretations aren't exactly what everybody else might think they would be based on what the code is and what past practices have been. So we want to make it clear. We'll add definition. There's a lot of things in our code that aren't defined, and so we need to define more things. We want to make it easier to use, not just for the folks that use it on a daily basis. You know, we have several consulting firms that use it a lot, but also if somebody, you know, wants to do something at their home through a home occupation or something like that, we want to make it more clear and easy for them to use it as well. So from the I might use the zoning code once in my life people to the people that use it every day, we want it to work better for all of them. We want to be able to accommodate new businesses. Obviously, you know, we all know about a few of these new kind of businesses that have come up since the 70s. We have check cashing companies, we have tiny homes, we have the sharing economy with the Airbnbs and things like that. And so we're actually going to use some national coding systems so that when a new use comes in and it gets coded, it will give us some guidance to where that would fit in our zoning code. I think that'll be very helpful to us. We want to preserve and enhance the quality of the community that we have, especially at the neighborhood level. And then we want this to be a quality place, and we start developing quality as we go through the development process and we do city projects. And so we have several quality places, and we want to make sure that we enhance and continue to develop that type of quality within the community. So we've been taking community feedback since last fall. We had our first large zoning public meetings last fall, and we had another series a couple weeks ago. Our attendance was much better in the fall, but we sent a postcard to every household last fall, and we used social media and the other UG marketing techniques to let people know about this one. But we did invite everybody who had ever gave us interest or gave us an email. They got a direct invitation. And we've also been talking with the folks that you placed on the steering committee who represent the community. And this is kind of a representative sample of the different types of things that we've been hearing very regularly throughout the process. You'll notice that one of the odd things, zoning is really a land use tool to a large degree, and there's not much about land use on here, you know, where commercial goes, where residential goes. It seems like that part of it, they feel like we're doing a pretty good job with. It's the details of that we want to get into and do a better job with how we make those processes work together. So a little bit about the steering committee. The first time we met with the steering committee, they basically said, this is too big, we need to meet more than you thought. So we've come back and we've started meeting monthly. So we've had 7 meetings with the steering committee. You appointed them, and it's a diverse mix of residents and businesses, because every commissioner had an appointment that was represented the business community and the residents or neighborhoods. And I'm going to talk to you in a minute about some of the ways we've been going through the steering committee and helping them to learn about zoning and what it is and how we've taken their feedback. But we use electronic polling in those meetings to see where they stand on different issues, so you can kind of get feel for the room and where we're in agreement and where we're not. I will say they challenge us, both myself, the rest of my staff, and the consulting team. They don't, and they shouldn't accept what we say at face value all the time. But they're also out listening to the community as well. So the next three issues I'm going to talk about are examples of how the steering committee looks at a problem. So the first one is parking. And so we know we have kind of these four issues related to parking that are kind of national issues. Commercial neighborhoods and the boundaries between commercial and residential and how those two intersect to support business and the residential part of our community. How much parking is enough? How much parking is too much? You know, there are places around the Legends where it looks like we have more parking than we'd ever need, and some places where you can't ever park. And so we have both of those, and you know, very within short distances of each other in different parts of the community. And then as we look to the future, we want to look at how do we reuse unused parking. There's you know, this is going on a little bit with the Cabela's parking lot and what they're looking at with some of the issues they've had with Sporting KC and other things. But if we go to a more autonomous vehicle fleet, then we won't need as much parking in these areas, and perhaps how are we going to use that parking, and it might give us other opportunities. That's a long way in the future, and I know there's all kinds of things about autonomous cars, but that's one of those things that we want to think about a little bit. We're not going to build the code around that, but the more we have a sharing economy, if that holds up, then it would be an issue we would want to face. And so we looked at, we asked them some questions. What's important to you about parking? Parking at my destination should be easily available. Parking should be available, but either hidden behind buildings or heavily landscaped. Parking should include spaces for both vehicles and bicycles. Parking should not be the dominant feature of development and should be subordinate to pedestrian, bicycle, and transit access. So in the realm of the parking world, those are four pretty big questions. And so you see that people said that parking ought to be convenient, 35%, and people said that parking shouldn't be the dominant and we should allow for pedestrian, bicycle, and transit access as well. So that gives us some guidance with them, and that tells us that then the consultant will take those questions and delve into it a little bit more to see where the steering committee would be, and do we need to have one global policy for the city, or do we need to have more sub-area policies for the city, depending on where we are and what we're doing. So this discussion took about an hour and a half to talk about parking with the steering committee, and I think we still have some time left just on parking. So we've met with them for 14 hours so far, and there's a lot of big issues, and we have a lot of work left to do. Related to landscaping, you know, there's differences in the urban and the suburban parts of the community, like downtown along Minnesota Avenue versus if you build a new pad site somewhere else in the community. We've heard comments about being more specific about landscape and screening and the buffer standards, and then also what type of landscaping should be required in new residential developments, because in like with the narrow lot design guidelines, we require shrubbery and a couple of trees per lot, and then we have some new subdivisions that maybe have one tree in the front yard if it didn't die. And what kind of neighborhoods do those build, and what kind of quality does that build over time? Then this isn't necessarily directly landscaping, but this was another one of the questions. What should the zoning code include? Guidelines for transportation modes, guidelines for landscaping, guidelines for street trees, guidelines for architectural and design, guidelines for lighting, which actually was one of the highest scoring thing, and then others that, you know, there was a few others that people commented on. But we use that to see where we need to focus with the steering committee. And finally, we've talked about preserving and enhancing neighborhoods and possibly using a conservation district. Obviously, you know, we have historic districts, but we have neighborhoods that there might be parts of those neighborhoods that conservation is a worthy goal for, and how do you create that neighborhood? How does it get adopted? What are the characteristics of the neighborhood, and what parts of that neighborhood should be conserved? So those are all questions with that. How do you transition out of that? What are those design standards? We've had interest from some parts of the community related to that, and so we're pursuing that as an alternative. It wouldn't be something that was necessarily mandated in the code, but we would put that as an option if a neighborhood wanted to pursue that. So related to process, this is, kind of a current chart of our current process, and this was kind of state of the art in 2004 when we went through and redid the zoning process. So we talked about, do you need a pre-application conference? Do you need a neighborhood meeting? Who recommends, who decides, and who's the appellate body? So staff, planning commission, board of commissioners, board of zoning appeals, landmarks commission, and what kind of notices? Do we publish it? Is there a mailed notice? Is there a sign? And we'll probably have something a little along these lines in the future, but it may also talk about other parts of the zoning process in a chart form so it's easy to see. So there's different parts of the process. You have the initiation of the process. How do you initiate a process? And that's important for that to be very clear, especially for those folks that may only use it once. Then how do you do the notices for that? Who needs to know about it? How do you conduct the public hearing process, and how do you record the results? And so we're going to build our process further around those principles than we did before. But that's kind of a graphic of what the process might be. So if you're going to do a change your zoning district, so you'd have a pre-application meeting, you'd file your application, we'd see if it's complete or not, we'd publish the appropriate notices. It would go to one of the planning commission, the board of commissioners for a decision, the board of zoning appeals potentially, based on a criteria. What happens to subsequent applications related to that, because we'll have preliminary plats and preliminary plans that then go to final plat or final plan, or how is that final plan amended? And then what's the scope of that? How do you appeal that decision? What's the scope of the approval and the legal effect on that? And so one of the things that our code doesn't address right now is at what point does somebody have a right to continue the development? We have a little bit on that, but we probably need to be more specific on that. And then, guidance on, how is the urban planning and land use department supposed to keep these records? So everybody will be clear on that. So on zoning district format, you've seen a little bit of this before in my last presentation, but right now where you have where it might say R1 residential and you have a whole bunch of text, we're going to describe graphically with charts and graphs what that district is, so that you get that initial picture before you get into the text. And the house is in the air, just to show where the house would be on the lot, so you can see underneath it what part is the yard and what part is the home there. Showed you this as well. So there'll be a table that has every zoning district and every use that we categorize in that table, so that you can look at one place and see what you can do where. This will also go into the Encode software, so that if you want to just do a search in Encode to see where you could do a business, this will go directly into that program. And so we'll have the graphic map that matches with the table, that matches with the text. Trying to coordinate all that, once again, to streamline it and make it a little bit easier to use. Now, use regulation simplification is something that's very important, because right now when somebody comes in and they want a special use permit for live entertainment, to tell them what they should expect, we refer back to a past staff report that creates a history of the actions we've taken. We want to codify those things. And so we want to go through all the special use permits and say, do we need extra standards for those? And if we have the extra standards for these, do they even need a special use permit? So we're going to try and take some of them completely out of the process and make them by right, so that it's more clear about what folks can do. But right now we have different uses, and is it embedded in the regulations? Are there specific sections? Does it require a special use permit? Is it allowed in the district, or are there design standards? And so rather than having it like this, we will have a list of the uses that have standards in a separate section, and you can just go to that separate section on standards for that use. And they'll be hyperlinked within the code. So if you want to do beekeeping and you see the definition of beekeeping, it will also link you back to the standards for beekeeping so that the code on the computer document works much faster and much easier. So some of the things we've thought about for new regulations, on the residential side, there's a lot of things that we've talked about. Some of them we've dealt with a little bit. We want to do a recheck on those, make sure we're still in the right place with those. But a couple of them that we haven't really addressed before, we haven't ever addressed composting to any significant degree. We don't really have anything on home agriculture. You know, can you grow a row crop in your front yard? Some communities do allow that. One in particular is large animals, and how large animals are kept in non-agricultural areas. And so we want to address that as we move forward with this, and likely using a standard that would say how many animals can be on this property before you would need to do some type of waste management on an ongoing basis. And not just define the area of the lot, because you could have a 3-acre lot, but that would mean you might be able to have 3 horses. But if you only have a half an acre where your horses can go, you can't have 3 horses on half an acre kind of thing. So we're going to look at those, and we'll be presenting those options and alternatives to you, because there are some standards out there that I think are pretty widely recognized, and they relate back to the keeping the environment clean, which is one of the things that the Conservation District always addresses anyway. On the commercial side, you know, some of the uses that might have more negative impacts. Obviously, we've dealt with automotive uses, so with the new special use permit requirements, we're going to recheck that. Animal rendering, we have a kind of a smell issue in part of the community with an animal rendering plant. How do we use our sidewalks, and where do we, what type of sidewalk do you need before you could put some chairs out there and have sidewalk seating and things? We want to make those things easy, so it tells people exactly how they can do those. And also, you know, sharing economy I mentioned before. Telecommunications is hard because the federal government and the state government seem to change those all the time, and so they're always making our code somewhat out of date. So we're going to update that, knowing that you'll probably see updates on that on a very regular basis as we move forward. But we're also going to, as I mentioned, review all of the special use permit uses that we have currently. I don't generally like to put up paragraphs, but I think this one is really good. So while I take a drink, I'll allow you a moment to read that. But the standards for specific uses, I think, is one of the places where the code will become much simpler. So we want to decide what things we should allow by right and what ones we want case-by-case review on. And we're going to test that with the steering committee, and then we'll present that to you all, to the Planning Commission and you all for final action. But I think that part of what we're doing is going to make a huge difference in how easy it is to use the code, and it will seem, I think when we do it this way, it will seem less arbitrary than it does now. Because we recognize that sometimes it looks arbitrary, but we're trying to take a 40-year-old code and make it fit in today's times, and that's difficult, especially when we're coordinating through the development review process. All the public works departments, fire, building inspection, BPU, and we're kind of trying to coordinate all that. So we're trying to make this process work and coordinate it all together so we have a uniform process. I think it's pretty good now, but I think it will be better in the future with some of these. And then I want to leave you with, these are the different things that we're doing to help gain public input. We haven't done a pop-up meeting in a while. We did right at the beginning, but once we get the draft of the plan done, we'll do more pop-up meetings. We'll have more public meetings. Obviously, I've talked about the steering committee. We've met with people that use the code on a regular basis. We use the urban planning and land use newsletter, so if somebody gives us their email at one of these, they get on that, so they get updates. I'm the primary contact here, and then we have some Facebook and Twitter through the consulting team that we're using. So we have a lot of methods out there for people to get in contact with us. Even though zoning is not the most exciting topic in the world, we do have a lot of people that are interested in it. I had a couple of calls today related to somebody that owned 20 acres, and they wanted to know what we're doing with agriculture. And you know, I just don't know that the agricultural zoning district is going to change in a way that affects many people, but I told him what the process was, where we're going to be, and when he should look for that and review that for comment. So With that, Mr. Mayor, would be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you. A couple things. You mentioned that there will be a transition period where we would utilize both the current code and then what we would transition to.
That's a possibility. I think we'll talk about that as we move forward, but you would either give, say that we'll adopt the code, but it'll become effective in 3 or 6 months or something like that, or you would give some kind of other there's a different ways to do the transition, but I guess my main point was we'll have some type of transition, and we don't have that exactly laid out, but that's a possibility. Because sometimes it might be more beneficial to use the new code for somebody, and they would want, why are you making me wait 6 months for this, right?
Because there will be projects in the works
Right.
as we transition in, so you're going to have to make allowances. The second question I have is there, as part of that transition, is there a beta test? Is there a time, because what I think, what we're trying to get to is, what is the experience of those who are applying or going through the planning and zoning process? What is their experience going through the process? And is it something, do they experience it, the zoning and the planning and zoning thing, as something which enhanced the process for them and made it easier and better for them, or did they feel as if it might have choked off? And there might be things that will be choked off just because they don't fit the code. But to really change how we look at this so that we're really looking at those who have to go through the planning and zoning process, how does it work for them or against them? And because again, as you said, especially those places where you have discretion and have to interpret, that's where the darts come.
Right. And there's, unfortunately, in a 40-year-old code, there's too many of those. So we are going to beta test projects side by side with each other on things that we have. And if we feel like we need a project of a type that we don't have actively with us, we will go back and find one to beta test just to see what the different outcome would be for that project. But I think we're going to rely on the folks on the steering committee as we go through the process, because many of them have been through that process, to say this would help, this wouldn't help, this will be more, if you did it just this way a little bit different, it would be more helpful to us, because we have on the steering committee folks that have used it a couple times. We have folks that use it every day. And so that's where we're going to use that part of the process. And we'll probably use some stakeholder interviews with that as well, just to talk through that. I think that some of those things might become more clear as you look at the code. For instance, if one of the ways we could streamline the code would be that once your preliminary plan is approved, if you comply with the preliminary plan, you could go straight to DRC and not go through final plan review. That would obviously eliminate part of the process, and that would make that shorter. I don't think anybody would say, that would make that a harder process. But there will probably be things in there where we're going to be asking the steering committee, if we did it this way, is it better? If we do it that way, is better. And that's why I think we're also going to have a period where we're going to come back shortly, in 18 months to 2 years, or sooner if we had to say, and ask those people, has this been good? Did we miss something? Can we come back? Because it's hard to beta test that. How does it feel to you part
Right.
without going through it? And I think that, like we knew with the sign code, we knew it was pretty good. We probably figured it wasn't exactly perfect. And so we needed to set that time in the future where we would come back in short order and look at that again. And so that's, I think, how we would deal with that.
And I think that, that the ongoing discussion because things will develop, that we know what we're reaching for here, what we're trying to achieve. We want to continue to survey that to see if we're
Right.
achieving it. Commissioner Kane?
Do we have any tiny houses?
We don't have any tiny houses yet.
When we get one, I want to know where it's at.
Well, I do have a picture of one I took on I-70 just west of 78th Street that was on wheels rolling through the community, but I didn't follow it to see where it stopped.
I think some people would say Highland Crest has some tiny houses, if 600 square feet is tiny. Commissioner Markley?
So 2 questions. One, or I guess concerns, not even really questions. We're doing this whole stormwater thing, and part of the stormwater rate change is that there can be benefits given to companies that do certain things. So I just want to make sure that you guys are coordinating so that we don't say you can get a benefit for putting gravel here, and then our zoning code says you can't put gravel there. So let's just make sure that there's some coordination on that to make sure that the benefits we're saying that we could give somebody are actually possible.
I'm on that committee, so yes, we're doing that.
Perfect. And then the other thing I was going to say is I hope that we are thinking about environmental impacts, because we're not a community that can just go out and spend $1 billion planting trees to improve the environment. The only control we have over that is our policies and what we can ask other people to do. So as far as like some of our Johnson County neighbors, they pay for rain gardens and they pay for trees, and we can't do any of that. We don't have that many people. So our policy can be plant more than one tree in your new suburban neighborhood, and that's the only way we can influence that situation, because we don't have the money to do it ourselves. So I just hope we're thinking about those impacts and trying to get people to step up and be environmentally friendly as they're coming to us with changes to their residence or business.
Thank you.
Yes, Commissioner Bynum?
Is the committee grappling with finding a way to universally correct or help correct all of the non-conforming uses, particularly in the older parts of town where, I mean, you see that, I'm sure, all the time. So I don't know if there's a universal way to deal with that, but seems like it would be a good time to look at things like that. Can I ask a second question?
Mm-hmm.
Are you looking at things like street widths? Kind of goes back to the stormwater conversation a little bit, but not only that, it also goes back to the whatever that initiative is that's so great that talks about
Complete streets?
the safe streets and roads diet.
Complete streets?
Complete streets, road diet, yep.
You know, right here between the courthouse and the new juvenile complex, and then so on Ann and also on Armstrong, it amazes me that on both sides of that justice complex, we've literally cut the size of the street in half. And yet the cars go two directions just fine.
So on the first question, we are working on non-conforming uses, and the consultant has brought forward some fairly unique cutting edge ways to do that. And so, you know, typically the old way to do non-conformities was you can't expand, you can't do anything but maintain it, and if you violate any of this, it goes, you tear it down and go away. And some communities have been experimenting with, well, it may be a non-conformity, but do you want an empty dead building, or do you want to allow them to expand a little bit to make it work for more modern situations? And so we are working on non-conformities that way. The other way we're working on non-conformities is we're trying not to create more. Because when you create a new zoning code, you have a tendency to create more non-conformities. And so we are trying, and that's probably the number one thing I gave to the consultant was, I can't handle, 10,000 new nonconformities. I don't want 100 new nonconformities. So that's, we're trying to work through that issue in both of those ways. How do you allow a nonconformity to still be compatible with the neighborhood, but change a little bit to be, change with the times a little bit and survive and thrive and be a good part of the neighborhood and don't create more. We are looking at street widths. In fact, there's, as you might imagine, within the different departments, we have different interests in the streets and the street widths. And so I've asked between Public Works and Fire and Planning to get together and talk about that, because those are typically the three areas where the street widths have the most divergent views. And so we have a lot of work to do on that, because the International Fire Code says one thing, our code says another thing, and Complete Streets says something else. And so we need to bring those together into a uniform policy that we all can support and work together on, and is a benefit to our community as we build to the future.
If I could maybe just add one little piece to that, to Rob too, is, Commissioner, to your question, is to think also about the cost associated, not only the public cost but the private cost. So when we think about road widths, there's $1 attached to the width of the street. Likewise, when Rob was talking about parking, there's a dollar sign attached to businesses when you say, here, you gotta have this much parking. So trying to sort of balance, this is all a lot of balancing of different needs and different interests. But thinking about, as we're trying to promote small business and entrepreneurship, how do those costs weigh against some of the other desires or requirements?
All right. Thank you, sir. We appreciate it.
Thank you, and we'll be back soon. And often.
All right. So do we have a motion for executive session for consultation with our attorney to discuss matters related to litigation and to labor?
I move that the commission go into executive session until 7 p.m. to consult with our attorneys and to discuss confidential matters related to pending claims and litigation and confidential matters regarding the status and future direction of labor negotiations as justified under the Kansas Open Meetings Act, under the attorney-client privilege and the employer-employee negotiations exceptions, and that staff designated by the county administrator be present to participate in the discussion, and that we reconvene in open session at 7 p.m. in the commission chambers located on the first floor.
We have a motion and a second. Roll call. Or just
Roll call Johnson.
Aye.
Kane. Markley. Walters.
Aye.
Bynum.
Aye.
Burrows. Townsend.
Aye.
Kiernan.
Aye.
Gia.
Thank you. That passes. At this time, we'll move to the 9th floor conference room, and let's begin at 5:45.